Good evening, and welcome to Lincoln on the Verge, a conversation between Lincoln scholars Ted Widmer and Frank J. Williams. My name is Mary Carol Kenzia, and I'm the Executive Director of Literacy Volunteers of Washington County. Literacy Volunteers is a nonprofit organization that offers free one-on-one tutoring and conversation classes to adults who want to learn English, as well as adult basic education for those who want to improve their reading, writing, and speaking skills. You can find out more about us on literacy-washingtoncounty.org. I'd like to thank Sarah Cooper of the Margin Street Inn in Westerly for allowing us to use this beautiful and historic space for this event. Also, Rob Richens of Bay Breeze Interior and Hammond Housecraft, who was a Moses Brown classmate of Ted Widmer and helped introduce Ted to Literacy Volunteers. Thanks as well to Ann Earl, a longtime supporter of Literacy Volunteers, who has also known Ted since his Moses Brown days, and whose late husband Nat was a teacher and soccer coach to Ted. We appreciate the support of the Washington Trust Company, who is sponsoring this event. They are a champion of the Westerly community and Southern New England. Finally, I want to acknowledge the rich contributions of the Board of Directors of Literacy Volunteers, whose dedication and hard work animate our efforts in helping bring English language skills to the adults of Washington County. I'd especially like to thank Robin Springborn, Ann Driscoll, and Jennifer Richens Mellon for their help with this event. Now I'd like to introduce our two speakers. Ted Widmer is a historian and former presidential advisor who writes widely on history and politics, as well as on their intersection. He is a distinguished lecturer at the Macaulay Honors College of the City University of New York and has directed research centers and libraries, notably at the Library of Congress, Brown University, and Washington College. Widmer holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in the History and Literature of France and the United States, a Master of Arts in History, and a doctorate in the History of American Civilization, all from Harvard University. From 1997 to 2001, he was a foreign policy speechwriter and senior advisor to President Bill Clinton. In 2000, President Clinton asked him to assist in the planning process for the Clinton Library, and between 2001 and 2004, he collaborated with the former president on his memoir, My Life. He also served as a senior advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton from 2012 to 2014. Widmer is a frequent contributor to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the Guardian, and the New Yorker. Frank J. Williams served as Chief Justice of the Rhode Island Supreme Court from February 21 to December 2008 and spent that first 5 years before that as an Associate Justice of the Superior Court. He is one of the nation's leading authorities on the life and times of Abraham Lincoln and one of the country's most renowned Lincoln collectors. The Chief and his wife, Virginia, donated their Abraham Lincoln and Civil War collections to Mississippi State University in 2017 to continue to assist in the healing of our country. Since 2019, he has been emeritus founder of the Lincoln Forum, a National Assembly of Lincoln and Civil War devotees. Chief Justice Williams also served for 9 years as president of the Abraham Lincoln Association, as well as the president of the Ulysses S. Grant Association. The chief was born in Cranston, Rhode Island, received his A.B. in Government and History from Boston University in 1962, and then served in the U.S. Army, eventually rising to the rank of captain. Williams earned his Doctor of Jurisprudence degree from Boston University School of Law and a master's degree in taxation from Bryant University. He is now an adjunct professor at Roger Williams University School of Law and the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. And now, without further ado,
Thank you.
our guests.
All right, thank you very much for that, and for the literary volunteers of Washington County.
Thank you.
And it's good to see you, Ted.
Great to see you, Chief.
We mentioned the Lincoln Forum, and you just received their book award for Lincoln on the Verge, and we celebrated it a bit with a virtual presentation or interview between you and the new chairman, Harold Holzer. So welcome.
Thank you.
Now tell us what inspired you to write this book on Lincoln's journey. I call it a long-range reconnaissance patrol because of my service. But what enticed you to do this?
Well, we're helping literacy tonight, and I'm grateful to you for helping, and I'm grateful to Rob and Jennifer and their parents, who I remember really well, who've been involved with this cause for a long time. I've been reading about Lincoln in my own way for decades. Since I was a little kid, I've been reading books about Abraham Lincoln beginning in about 4th grade, 5th grade, and I saw his words written on walls around Washington, D.C. They're written on the inside of the Lincoln Memorial, as you know very well. And I was a speechwriter in those years, so words were very important to me, and I wanted to try to get closer to him. But it's intimidating, as you know. 16,000 books have been written about him. I bet you had a lot of them in your collection at one point. And so how do you make a dent in 15,000 books about Abraham Lincoln? And I wasn't sure. But then a path just opened up, and I'd love to tell you I knew it would be the right path. It was a little more haphazard than that. What happened is I was working with some other young historians so long ago that I was a young historian, and got interested in the story of this train trip, this 13-day train trip, and I thought, that's perfect. It's such a short amount of time. I can really tell the story of everything that happened to Lincoln over 13 days, and I won't overlap too much with any other book. And a Lincoln who's moving, who's on a train, is inherently interesting. He's not still. We think of him as still in a photograph or a sculpture, and as you know very well, he moved around. He moved around as a lawyer. He moved as president. He went on trips, and he was an animated person in every way. So I thought this was a good way to tell the story of Lincoln in motion.
Good. And yet, there's already been at least a couple of volumes on this trip, this journey. Victor Searcher, a generation ago, and Alan Pinkerton's more contemporary view at the time. And did you rely on other resources to help you write this? And by the way, this may have been a short time period, but it's taken you, 9 years?
It took me twice the length of the Lincoln administration to write about.
Right.
13 days.
Right. Well, and it shows, and it's appealing.
What I did is I really dropped down into the newspapers of America, and there are a lot of them. It's and again, literate. We're talking about literacy, and people love to read. They love to read newspapers and little pamphlets and printed broadsides, but really, especially newspapers. And I read a ton of local newspapers. Every town that Lincoln went through on his train, I tried to find their newspaper to get at what he looked like to someone in a small town as he was going through for the 3 minutes that Lincoln would ever come through that community. And he came to Rhode Island, as you know, in 1860. And so I read a lot of really local sources, and that was fun because a lot of Lincoln writing is sort of top down. It's very famous historians writing in a way that you're just trying to absorb their wisdom, but it was fun to read the impressionistic writings of people on the spot. Like he came through, he said something, it was sort of funny, he told a joke, and then he ate something, and then he kept going. And I found that kind of writing exciting. And in addition to the books you mentioned, Victor Searcher, which it was important to me, and Alan Pinkerton, who's the detective who helps to save his life, but also our friend Harold Holzer wrote a great book, Lincoln President-Elect, about the 6-month period between his election and becoming president. That was really important to me too.
I think so, exactly. Now, we're about to have another inaugural journey for January 20, 2021. But this is a much shorter trip from Delaware to the nation's capital in Washington. And yet, with what you've revealed in your great book is the people who were anxious to see the new president and were lined up on the railroads, not just in town or at the railroad station. So the perception was there, I think, for them to determine, and even Lincoln's secret trip into Washington because of threats. We'll get to that in a minute, I hope. So what accounts for this, and what is its importance, do you think?
Well, everybody knew that he was going to change America forever, but they didn't quite know how. They didn't know for sure this tremendous war was coming. I mean, they had an idea that it was, but when Lincoln was elected, it broke the back of Southern political control. The South had controlled politics for 70 years, more or less. There were a couple Northern presidents, but they're not very strong. And the South really had a lock on political power in Washington. From George Washington becomes president in 1789, the capital is actually in New York then, but then it moves to Washington in 1800. And then it's just one after another, Virginian presidents, or then Jackson for 2 terms, and it just feels like they control everything. And as a result, they really control the slavery debate, which is not a very good debate. It's a debate in which people are getting angry, and Northerners want it to go away, and the South is digging in, and it's not going away. And as this debate is getting more and more bitter, this totally unknown Western lawyer from a pretty small town in Illinois, it is the state capital, but it's, he's not even a Chicago lawyer, he's a Springfield lawyer. He sneaks in and gets the nomination over the much more well-known candidacy of William Seward, the senator from New York, and it's just a shock to everyone in America. And yet, it's the right nomination. He's a stronger candidate than Seward would have been. He wins all of these middle American states that Seward might not have won as easily. And he wins the whole thing. He wins the presidency. And everyone knows it's a historic moment. And the North has broken the lock, the Southern lock on power in this country. And so it feels like slavery might end, or it will change, or the expansion of slavery into the West, which was the most sensitive topic in 1860, that's going to stop. But then the South starts saying, we don't even want to be in this country anymore. It's a bit like recent events, just we refuse to accept the presidential election. You may think it went one way, but we don't agree. Or it was a different kind of a debate. They didn't say it was a fraudulent election. They just said, okay, your guy won. See you later. We don't want to be in this country anymore. So states start seceding. So as Lincoln's coming in, nobody knows, can he keep it all together, or will the USA now be 2 separate countries? So everybody wanted to see this guy who had been pretty unknown 6 months earlier or a year earlier, and just get a feel for what does he look like. There wasn't a whole lot of photography, so they didn't really know what he looked like, and then get a sense, where is our country going? So there was a lot of emotion about seeing him.
And let's talk about the 100 speeches, or some of them. Don't give all 100 now, but he hadn't really said any major political speeches since Cooper Union,
Right.
the preceding February of this journey. And he did speak many times contemporaneously in his stops and along the way, the 1,100-mile trip. And what do you make of that?
Well, that became one of the big themes of the book. I mean, I would love to tell you I had it all in my head when I started, and I really didn't. I just thought Lincoln on a Train would be a good story. And the title for a long time was Lincoln on a Train. I mean, it was just a 4-word title, and maybe that would have even been better. But then all these other themes came out to me, and one was the small town papers, and what does he look like to ordinary Americans? I mean, there's no such thing, because they're all different from each other, and they're not ordinary. But another big theme was, how is he developing as a giver of speeches? And he's really developing pretty fast. So he's organized, and before the trip starts, he writes out one speech for each city that he's going to. And if he only was going to give one speech, he would have been fine. But what happened was there was constant pressure, the curiosity to see this celebrity. He's not only a president-elect, he's really one of the first celebrities in this country, and everyone wants to get a look at him. And he had to give speeches all day long, 10, 15, 20 impromptu speeches a day. And he often did what he was very good at. He'd tell a little joke and then say, thank you, and now I'm going to sit down, and he would get away with it. But sometimes he would stay up there and talk a little longer. And that's where it got very interesting, because you see the real Lincoln as he's up there talking. And I'm glad that people kept calling on him to come out and speak, because you see more of this real guy, and the wheels are turning in his head, and he's developing very fast. So over the 13 days, he starts giving these incredible speeches about the meaning of America, and the meaning specifically of the Declaration of Independence, and this idea that it belongs to all of us. We all have human rights. The word all implies all races and all ethnic backgrounds, and men and women. And he's saying that in a pretty inspiring way by the end of the trip. So the development of Lincoln the speaker is one of the big themes of the book.
And you think he fared well in doing this, and there's been some controversy among Lincoln scholars and people who study him about his extemporaneous speeches, which were not as good as when he wrote them down. I don't think anyone is really that better a extemporaneous speaker than having a prepared talk, but there was a difference in style and in quality between the two methods, right?
Most of the time, yes, but there are a couple extemporaneous ones that he hits a grand slam, and so it's a little hard to predict. The farewell address, when he starts the train trip, he says goodbye to his townspeople, his fellow citizens of Springfield. It's an unbelievably beautiful short speech, haunting, saying goodbye, talking about the weight of the challenge that's on him, and pretty strong feeling in the air that he knows he might not come back, which he didn't. He didn't come back alive. He came back on a train for his funeral, but that's an incredible speech that I argue was a breakthrough because you got to hear the real feelings of a living, breathing president-elect. It wasn't a canned speech, it was real emotions. He talked about how much he loved the people he was leaving in his town, and how he'd raised his children there, and how he was leaving one of his children buried there. And just that was a deep kind of emotion that you didn't really get in a lot of political speeches of that era. And then at the end of the trip, he goes into Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and for him, that's a kind of quasi-spiritual experience because he loves the founders. He lives and breathes the words of Washington and Jefferson and Adams and Madison and Hamilton. And even though he didn't have a very good education, back to literacy of South County, he read a lot. He learned by reading books. And so to go into that chamber and be there communing with the spirit of the founders was quasi-religious experience for him. And he just said, every political feeling I've ever had in my life comes from the things that were said and done in this room. And I think that was off the cuff. I don't think there was a piece of paper in front of him. So now and then he would hit a home run without a piece of paper. But the two inaugural addresses, yes, they were absolutely written out.
And by the way, consistent with this feel about the founders, I might say as a lawyer and judge that his feelings for the Declaration of Independence and the vision contained therein was so much paramount to him, even
Yes.
more so than the Constitution
Yes.
itself, which was a compromise
Right,
with slavery, among other issues.
right.
So that sacredness that he had for the Declaration of Independence was imbued by him
Yes.
in his visit to Philadelphia.
Absolutely.
I think so. But you didn't like exactly the Pennsylvania tariff speech, for example, did you?
It was
In Pennsylvania, that he delivered in Pennsylvania.
It was kind of refreshing to know that Lincoln could give a bad speech. He gave a couple bad speeches, and he's a human, so that was nice. And everything about that moment was hard. It was raining. He had to give an economic speech because they really cared in Pittsburgh. The tariff was related to the growth of industries, which, by the way, was very important here in Rhode Island too, where we had textile mills. So they needed government protection of young industries. And so he gave a pretty boring speech about that.
And what about his planning with his allies on the journey? And he wanted to go south to the state of his birth, Kentucky, but he seemed to stay in the north and go from capital to capital. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, a little bit, I think, was some legitimate fear that he might get pulled off the train and roughed up or worse. And he wrote a letter to his very close friend, Joshua Speed, who lived in Kentucky, saying, I might be lynched if I went to the state of my birth. I think some of it was just, it would be embarrassing to have a bad event. They really needed to keep Kentucky and Virginia in the U.S. They were both states with a strong feeling for the South. They weren't automatically Southern states. I mean, we think Virginia, where Robert E. Lee was from, was automatically a Confederate state. And, Virginia was a very proud American state. It's where Washington, the father of our country, came from. And Lincoln really wanted to keep Kentucky and Virginia and Maryland and Missouri in the U.S., and he kept them all in except for Virginia. But then he turned this winding northern trip, winding all over the place, into good politics. So yeah, he visited all the governors of all of those states, and he needed to get them behind him. Governors were very important back then. And if he needed to draft an army, that was done through governors. There wasn't yet a national draft. So the winding trip through state capitals, through Indianapolis, Columbus, Albany, Harrisburg, that served a political purpose for him too.
Well, why don't you now put yourself, as you did in your book, Ted, in Lincoln's head? What do you think his chief goals en route to Washington? Let me give you some examples. Getting to D.C. alive. You've already touched upon that in his letter to his intimate friend, Joshua Speed. Nipping secession in the bud. 7 states had already seceded. Winning over Northerners who didn't vote for him. Introducing himself, which I think you've covered, or all of the above.
All of the above. You nailed it, Chief. You couldn't have said it better. He was such a neophyte. You know, his last political office, he was a one-term congressman 12 years earlier. So he was not well known to anybody, and his one term had not been very successful. In fact, he'd gotten in hot water by criticizing a very successful war, the Mexican War. So it's amazing that he then becomes the commander-in-chief of a huge war, because the one thing he was known for was being somewhat anti-war during the Mexican War. So yes, he's got to introduce himself to the North as well as to the South, and just keep the pot on this boiling kettle to try to keep everything together. And yes, goal number 1 you mentioned was to not get killed. That was a pretty important part of the agenda. So he succeeds in every way. He makes it alive. It took some doing, but he got to Washington. He was exposed to, a million or so Northerners who saw him in person en route. He deepened his message. He began giving truly beautiful speeches that begin to hint at the Gettysburg Address to come. And, no one saw that coming. No one knew that this obscure Western politician had that kind of stuff inside of him. And he met people who would serve in his cabinet. Pennsylvania was a tough state for him. There were 2 factions who hated each other, and he had to bump some heads together in Pennsylvania. And he accomplished all of those goals. So by the time he got off the train, I argue at the end of this book, he was much stronger than when he got on the train, when he's just a kind of distant, not quite a nobody. I mean, he's the president-elect, but he's a stranger to a lot of Americans. And by the time he comes in, he's established this personal rapport with all these people, men and women, old people, children who see him en route. And he's an interesting-looking man. He's not only very tall and thin, but he's got this beard coming in. There's never been a bearded president. He's got this tremendous sadness in his face. And you know that better than anyone because you collected images as well. For those of us who go deep with Lincoln, the face never stops being interesting. I mean, you get a kind of personal feeling for this man. It's not just his ideas, although they're very important, but what is inside of him. And there was this sort of emotional quality to this person who had some sadness, and people could feel that, and they were drawn to him, and they liked that about him.
It's funny you say about his face. It's still attractive, not the most handsome face.
Right.
And this is why artists and sculptors and printmakers really were taken with his looks. Even from the Currier and Ives print of the beardless Lincoln document or picture. Let's go to when he did get to Washington, or while he was, I think, in Columbus, Ohio. The Congress was going to vote and accept electoral votes. And our country has just been through upheaval, and a volatility that we hope that we never see again.
Yeah.
But there was a threat to deny his majority in the electoral votes, was there not? And you just wrote an excellent op-ed piece for the New York Times that was published this past week. And why, in view of the threat, there was not an incursion of the Capitol, the unfinished Capitol, in mid-February when the electoral votes were counted?
Well, every minute of that trip, there was a feeling that he might not get there. And so he's halfway through the trip, and it's February 13th, 1861. He's in Columbus, Ohio. Big crowd is gathered around. He's in the State House of Ohio. And that same day, in the House chamber in the Capitol, a scene unfolded a whole lot like what we saw a few days ago, where they were trying to count electoral certificates from all the states. They were carried in wooden boxes, and there was a feeling of disruption in the room, and a lot of Southern members of the House or the Senate were yelling, calling out that it wasn't legitimate, and there were people trying to storm the building from the outside. And they did get in this week, and you said it well, let's hope we never see it again. In 1861, the outside people, the troublemakers, were kept out because the head general of the army, Winfield Scott, had armed men at every door, and they wouldn't let anyone in unless they had a signed pass. So some troublemakers were kept out, but the elected officials were still in there trying to cause trouble, and they couldn't stop it from happening. And in an amazing scene, the vice president, John Breckinridge, was there certifying the vote, and he's the one who would have won. He ran against Lincoln. He was the South's candidate. And if the votes had disappeared, and that was a possibility, they just might get lost. If they had disappeared, it might have been thrown into the House for a second election, and Breckinridge might have done well in such an election.
But I think it points out the courage, the political and personal courage of General Winfield Scott.
Yes.
Who goes back to the War of 1812, right, and would do the same kind of security for the first inaugural on the east side of the Capitol on March 4th, which was Inauguration Day then.
Right.
And the Honorable Breckinridge, who was, as you indicated, the runner-up for the popular vote in the election of
right,
4 candidates.
And they're both Southerners, and,
right,
and they stood up for their country, even though the country was falling apart. On that day, they did the right thing.
Yes, and we need more of that.
That's right.
And I wonder too, and you point this out so well, that there was a parallel inauguration trip from Jefferson Davis, who would become the president of the Confederate States of America, so-called. That those are Lincoln's words, because he never recognized
right,
another nation coming out of seceded states. So you did a wonderful job in tracing his journey.
Well, I felt lucky. You know, this book just kept getting better as I was experiencing it. I felt like it was writing itself. And I've done other history books. Believe me, that feeling never happened. You're just kind of working on a history book that if it's a little bit boring to you, you know it's going to be boring to other people. And this one,
right,
I just couldn't believe how all these adventures kept happening. So Jefferson Davis is on a train of his own, racing to get to his inauguration at the same time.
And you can say too that Lincoln did confront hostile crowds in certain cities.
Did. Yep.
Like Albany and
yep,
New York City and Trenton,
yep,
even though he gave some majestic talks to the
that's right,
to the House and Senate in Trenton. What about the work that you did on the attempted assassinations, I don't think many people know that there was more than the Baltimore fear of being assassinated as its
Right.
train moved through Baltimore or changed depots in
Right.
Baltimore. There were other threats, were there not, that you
There
pointed
were
out?
constantly, the first day, there was an object was found on the track and removed at the last minute, even in Illinois. In Cincinnati, a bag was found in his car just before he boarded the train that had an explosive device in it. They got it off the train. Sometimes problems were created by people who liked Lincoln. Overeager militias would fire off the guns of their militia as he came into town. In one town in Ohio, it shattered all the windows next to him. In a town in upstate New York, they actually fired guns into the train as he was coming in. They just didn't know what they were doing. But the
I think we call that friendly fire.
friendly fire. But the worst crisis, and I didn't know how bad it was until I did some research, was this huge plot to kill him in Baltimore. And the last day of the trip, Baltimore had 3 train stations that were a little bit apart from each other, and you get off at one and transfer and go in a horse and carriage to the next, and they were going to surround him. As many as 1,000 people were signed up for this plot, and it was revealed a woman from Massachusetts was traveling through the South. She specialized in mental health, and I love this part of the story. That first of all, it's great. It's a pretty male world of Civil War history, and it was exciting to find a strong woman in that world. And the nature of her work, mental health, pretty great line of work. And she, in talking to some Southerners, she did that work when she discovered this big plot. And she came up north and told the CEO of a railroad based in Philadelphia. He hired some detectives. The detectives figured out it was true. They got word to Lincoln and his entourage, and they decided to go all night in an ordinary commuter train, kind of like that last train.
Without his family.
Without his family. That last train from Boston to Providence, you don't want to be on that train after a Red Sox game. And it was like a commuter train. And he got on with a couple friends, and he made it safely into Washington the next morning.
Is this woman that you mentioned, and I think so well and appropriately, Dorothea Dix?
Exactly. Yep, that's right.
So you bring this character, this living person, I think, to life when you describe the role that she played in intelligence and passing the word that there was a problem. Does it bother you that he went to Washington at night through Baltimore, but left the family behind to follow?
Yes, that's a very perceptive question, and it does, because his family still had to go through Baltimore on the train that had been announced, and an angry mob surrounded the train and demanded that Lincoln be dragged out. He wasn't on the train, so that didn't happen. But his wife and children were on the train, so they were in some danger. But I think there were assumptions then that we can't really imagine anymore, because we've seen so much terrible violence and terrorism, but that women and children were off limits then. People wouldn't hurt. There were notions of chivalry, and I think they were trusting in that, and it turned out to be true. But yes, I worried about that.
Ted, you know that there was a finger pointed at the ringleader of this alleged assassination of the president-elect in Baltimore, but neither he nor any of his followers were ever prosecuted or brought to trial. Has that ever bothered you, and has your research ever revealed why, who and why this occurred or did not occur?
All that has bothered me a lot. We have some records of it, but they are imperfect. The best records are the ones kept by Alan Pinkerton, who later goes on to found the U.S. Secret Service.
Horrible.
Really was important in getting out the information from the plot leaders and telling Lincoln. And she, in fact, rode on the train with him, the overnight train. But yes, the lack of convictions, of arrests and convictions is troubling. And I'm also a little troubled by something I don't know enough to really talk about, but it's on my mind that there are these threads that suggest, they do not prove, but they suggest some connections to the forming Confederate government in early 1861, meaning Jefferson Davis and other senators from southern states or southern cabinet members in the outgoing Buchanan administration. There's a guy named Jacob Thompson, who's Secretary of the Interior. He's from Mississippi. He is later, he might be involved in Lincoln's assassination 4 years later, 1865. That gets into the confusing world of the Lincoln assassination, and there are many people who know that far better than me. So I don't want to talk about things I don't know about too much, but it's troubling. The more you look into Baltimore, John Wilkes Booth is from Baltimore. There are family friendships. There's a money trail that includes Booth in 1864 and 1865. And I wondered a little bit if they missed him in 1861 and they succeeded in 1865.
And yet, we have friends like Ed Steers, who's done great work on Lincoln and the assassination, and believes that the conspiracy was much broader than
Right.
John Wilkes Booth and his merry men.
Right.
I say sarcastically, and that it really goes all the way up to the Confederate High Command, but there has been no probative evidence of this.
That's right.
And even though John Wilkes Booth was receiving funds from the Confederate Secret Service stationed in Canada,
That's right.
as you know,
Right.
in 1864 and 65.
Right.
So until we get this evidence, we really don't know.
Right.
But on a more positive note, when did he have time to work on fine-tuning his inaugural address, which is an hour and a half long?
Good question. I mean, that one he had started to write before the trip began. So he not only started to write it, he even had it set in type by a local printer. So he's got, the equivalent of a hard copy, a printed version that he can mark up. Although, catastrophically, he briefly lost it. He gave it to his son, Robert, who was probably having a couple drinks in a hotel lobby, and put it in a baggage check of a lobby, which was a very unsafe place to put this incredibly important document. Lincoln asked him for it a couple hours later, and he said, "Oh, it's safe. I just put it in the baggage check of the hotel." And Lincoln had a look of horror on his face and ran downstairs, and the description says he leapt over the desk. Would have loved to have seen that if we had movie cameras back then, but he just started opening people's luggage, and after about 10 found the right one. His speech was still there. So that speech he was able to work on the hard copy, but a lot of these very important speeches he is improvising. He's just going out there and giving them off the cuff.
And no copies.
Right.
They had a form of copying documents, but it was pretty rudimentary. No PCs, of course, right?
Right, right.
No scanning. And that was the only copy,
Yep.
which is now in the Library of Congress with all of the emendations from
Yeah.
the printed version from the president-elect,
Yeah, it's
as
incredible.
is the original of the second inaugural.
Right.
So, but you really develop the environment around the train, the presidential train. the cannon, you just mentioned cannons going off, friendly fire, the telegraph, towns. Lincoln barely looked out the window. So how did he even sleep is a question.
I don't think he was getting a lot of sleep. In the last night, he didn't even have a bed. He's just curled up in a compartment of a passenger train. So he was awake a better part of the night going into Washington. He was staying in hotel rooms, and well into the 20th century, many of these hotels preserved the room that he stayed in. So there are still, you can see photographs of what the furniture looked like, which was fun for me. But I think it was very hard to get any. I mean, he's also a parent of young children, which is interesting. He looks so serious. We don't have a smiling photograph of Lincoln, although he is known to have smiled and he had a good sense of humor. But he's also a relatively young president with young kids and staying in hotel rooms, a different one every night. So in a way, that's great. I mean, he had beds, but I don't think he was getting a lot of sleep. And they're all incredibly wired and excited because this is the trip of a lifetime. Just so tens of thousands of people every stop trying to cheer them on, touch him, shake his hand. His hand was hurting every moment of the trip. I mean, he was in agony and his voice was giving out. But it was the trip of a lifetime. And I think he went a lot on adrenaline, but he was also getting exhausted.
His hand would be hurting for the duration of his presidency,
Right.
with his public opinion baths when he opened the executive mansion to the public, and they just wanted to be there,
Exactly.
many of them, to shake his hand,
Right.
along with the office seekers and
Yep.
the military and the politicians and everyone else. Did his press reviews, do you think, got better in view of your looking at a divergent press that we had at that time, and certainly more respected then as now, and more read then
Yes.
as now, and clearly identifiable by party, Whigs, Free Soils, Republicans, Democrats, Know-Nothings, anti-immigrants, and so on?
He was getting every kind of press you could imagine. Great press, horrible press. Our friend Harold Holzer's done amazing work on this, and he cooperated often in the writing of articles about him. He knew reporters. He would talk to them and shape their articles about him. Sometimes they would come to him after a speech and say, is this the speech you just gave? And he would look it over and change a few words, so he's sort of improving it before it gets sent out across the wires. And it was wires, it was telegraph wires, so it was sent out very fast. I mean, one thing exciting about this time is give a speech in Indiana, it could be read in New York 10 minutes later. So it was not unlike today in that the words were moving around the country very fast. The parties that liked him always praised him. The parties that hated him, and there were a lot of them, he could never buy a good review. Lincoln gave another horrible speech. He's not qualified to be president. He's uneducated. He looks like a peasant or a farmer. How could this guy ever have been elected? So he was dealing with everything.
Why do you think he grew his beard after the election?
I think it was a kind of armor. I just think he knew they were going to throw everything at him, and it was just one more layer of protection. I mean, the story is a young girl,
Grace Bedell.
Grace Bedell, wrote him a letter. She had all these older brothers and said, if you look a little better, you grow a beard, I might be able to swing some votes for you in my family. Because he looked so thin, she thought he'd look a little bit more like a serious person if he had the beard. And the amazing thing is he did it. He wrote her a letter saying, I don't think I'll do it, but then he did it. And then he met her on the train route.
Yes, he did. And asked to see her.
That's right.
And Do you have any thoughts on the credulity of the anti-Lincoln cartoons with him sneaking into Washington with a Scotch cap and plaid overcover, on whether that's true or not?
It's true that the cartoons were published. One of the newspapers that usually liked Lincoln was the New York Times, so we still have it. But the writer in the New York Times was really mad at Lincoln on the night that he snuck in on the secret train, because they locked up all the reporters in a hotel in Harrisburg and they wouldn't let them out. And it was like a war measure. It was like, this is such a matter of such national security. Reporter named Joseph Howard filed a fake story, fake news, and said Lincoln put on a Scottish disguise, which meant a kind of tam o' shanter hat and a kilt. And right away, that was like a gold mine for cartoonists, because they could draw this awkward, tall, skinny guy in a little kilt with his naked legs sticking out of the bottom of it, and it was funny. And Lincoln did look funny, so America had a field day with sarcastic cartoons about Lincoln in a Scottish outfit. None of it was true. He did wear a different jacket and hat, but he didn't have a disguise on.
And a last question, I think, for our viewing public, which we appreciate. Who was advising Lincoln on this trip or on anything else? Horace Greeley, who was jumping on and off the train, or what is your take on that?
He had his Illinois advisors, including his wife. His wife's complicated person for all of us in the Lincoln field, because she has good days and bad days, but she was a close political advisor, and they loved each other. Then there are the Illinois-based political advisors, Orville Browning, David Davis, guys like that. He's talking to William Seward, an important New York politician, more and more, and I think Seward really did a lot of the heavy lifting on the train trip, organizing the route, making sure the train companies did anything Lincoln said, sent out a guy to sort of run things for Lincoln. And then once he got to Washington, he had an old friend, an Illinois congressman named Elihu Washburn, and he was getting to know the Republicans. The Republicans were a very new party. In many cases, they didn't really know each other. Lincoln was the first Republican to ever win. So it's like a brand new party coming together, and he's got to make these friendships for the first time, which he does once he gets to Washington. So his advisors are all over the place, but they're really spread kind of thin. He's improvising a lot on this journey.
But he is developing a network that would support him during, both in Congress and out, that would be supporting him during his presidency.
Absolutely.
So we'll turn this over or back to Mary Carroll, but we hope people will consider Lincoln on the Verge. It's just a great book, and really Ted is the second Rhode Islander with two wonderful books that were published this year, Ed Acorn's and yours.
And we're so lucky in this state. We've got two great institutions for the study of Abraham Lincoln, the John Hay Library at Brown University and Chief Justice Frank Williams. And we have it pretty good here in Rhode Island.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ted. I didn't pay you for that.
Thanks to my friends in the Richens family and literacy volunteers.
Yes, and thank the literacy group in Washington County for this.
And all my high school friends, I think there are a few of them, and I'm happy
Yes.
I can't see them, but I hope I will see them soon, so.
Yeah.
Mary Carroll, thank you.
Well, thank you both. This was just such a fascinating and interesting evening to hear your knowledge and share these little anecdotes. It couldn't have been better. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank Connor McGill and Gabe and Jeffrey, our production team, for a fantastic job. And I'd like to thank all of you watching tonight for supporting us and taking part in this wonderful event. And again, as the chief said, please consider buying Lincoln on the Verge. It's a fascinating book. So thank you very much on behalf of literacy volunteers of Washington County, and good night.